it doesn't matter what adventure you're going on right now in your life, you have the opportunity in every place to contribute at a higher and higher level so that you do spread value and goodness and kindness wherever you go.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblin. Today, I have the privilege of talking with Simon Drew. Simon is an alignment coach. He's a poet. He's an author. He's a musician. He's a photographer. He's many things. He's also a podcast host. He is most well known probably for his podcast, The Practical Stoic, which has now evolved into the Walled Garden podcast. Which I highly recommend checking out, not just that, but all of his work. He recently released a book called The Poet and the Sage, which I got to admit is pretty damn good. So we had a wonderful chat today about many different things, of course, Stoicism and art. A big focus of it is on art and music and the creative process and all that stuff. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Simon Drew, how are you, man? Thanks for joining me.
Brandon, thanks, mate. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I know we've only just recently met, but I'm very excited. I think what you're doing is great, and I've heard only good things, and so yeah, man. Whatever you want to know, let's talk about it.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I've heard a lot of great things about you, and we have at this point several mutual friends. So yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with you, man. You just had a book come out. So, and it's your first one, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Yeah, called The Poet and the Sage. Yeah.
And how does that feel, man, to have your first book published?
Yeah, well, it's, there's still many processes that are kind of in the middle of happening, coming to pass. And so there's still a lot to do. I'm still in the process, for example, of recording the audio book. And I don't know, man. I think I'm just the kind of person, I don't take a lot of time to stop and get excited about what has happened. I'm more kind of looking to what's that next thing that I've got to be doing. And so, but having said that, like I'm honored that I'm in a position to be able to present my first book, and especially a book like this, which is really so close to my heart. I'm also just honored that I was able to stumble across certain people who were willing to, take the risk and invest in my own art, my own, occupation to bring this out to people. So, yeah, I'm grateful more than anything, I guess, at this stage. It's a real honor. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned, going on to that next thing, and I feel that a lot myself, like I figure there's a time, if we're lucky, we get to the golden years, we get to become old, and I think that's more of a privilege than it is necessarily a bad thing. But, I figure at that point in time, that's a good time to look back on your life and sort of appreciate your accomplishments. But I find the same thing where you finish something and you just move on. Now, I got to ask, because I think some people struggle with this. They struggle with achieving a goal, and then all of a sudden it's like, you get to the top of a mountain, then you fall off the cliff because, you feel lost or something. Do you feel that, or is it more or less you're just in love with the process of learning, the process of growing? Like, what do you think about that?
Definitely the process is an element of it. I think my major issue at the moment is the output is just endless for me personally at this point. Like when I wrote The Poet and the Sage, it was really a process of just allowing this work, this poetry, this prose to just kind of flow out onto the page, and it came rather quickly. It came over a few months, and there was this kind of finished book by the end of it. Obviously, I edited it and everything, but then, and I think a lot of artists have this problem as well, is when you finish one thing, you can't stop and spend all the time with that before you then move on to like everything else. And so I find that I've still got about 5 or 6 journals full of they're full of the next 2 books, but they're also full of other poems that I have yet to transcribe onto my computer. But then every day I just want to write more and more because it keeps on coming. The inspiration keeps on coming for what I want to be writing. So I'm kind of, I think the big issue that I'm dealing with artistically is the output is there. I've got to spend the right amount of time dealing with that output and figuring out where to put it so that it actually gets out there to people. And I think, so when I say, I have a hard time, stopping and appreciating, I also understand that there's an element of that is, as Seneca might have said, a disease of the soul or an illness of the soul. I mean, Alan Watts, he said something really beautifully. He said, if you're always wondering what's next, then when what's next comes to you, you won't be there to see it, right? And I always recognize an element of that in my life, but I also recognize that I am kind of on this artistic path, and so my biggest weakness is going to be learning how to, actually put the stuff that I've created into the places that it needs to be, so that the output is useful and not just me standing in a room writing in some journals. I guess.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with that, man. And that, honestly, that kind of speaks to this idea that Nietzsche had, which I like. He had this idea of like the will to power, right? Like you go, and he didn't mean power in terms of oppressive power. He meant like becoming your best self. It's something like that, right? So Nietzsche sort of promoted that over a lot of other philosophies. It's an interesting idea that, as opposed to sort of toning your desires too much, is like you go after something, you achieve it, and then you go on to the next thing, all through on this path of getting better. And so it's sort of a weird contrast to the idea of like quenching your desires versus going after what you want. But I think it's probably a balance of the two, right? And I actually feel a similar thing with the podcast, to be honest, because I when I put out episodes, sometimes I'm like a month in advance. And so it's very interesting because when I release an episode, I'll get comments or I'll get messages from people, and it's almost like it's an older piece of me, even though it's a month ago. And so I recognize and I still believe in that stuff and I still appreciate it, but it's almost like creatively I've moved on. You know what I mean? Yeah, so it's sort of this weird thing, and I definitely resonate with that in terms of your, output versus creative versus output. It's like it's almost two different worlds, and having that flow naturally is a very difficult thing, right?
Oh yeah, and I think every single artist should be studying, great philosophy and great wisdom of the past. One of the things that really has changed me is getting to know the writings of Heraclitus a little bit more. And of course, for those who are practicing Stoics, they will know that Heraclitus originated this idea that we're standing in a river and the river's constantly changing and we're constantly changing. This is such an important lesson for artists. I think artists get this more than the general population. It's because we recognize that we are constantly in this process of transformation. Miles Davis has been somebody who's been very influential on me. He had this great advertisement that he did for Honda scooters right at the height of his career, and it's actually a really strange, eerie kind of advertisement. Like, I don't know how they sold any scooters with this advertisement, but he says something and it's really brilliant. He says, "I'll play it now and I'll tell you what it is later." And I think that every artist should listen to that, and every person who's interested in finding out who they truly are should probably listen to that. Because, what he means is, as an artist, you don't quite know what it is that you're creating until you've created it. And even then, you're not quite sure. And that certainly happened with The Poet and the Sage. As I was writing this, and I'll tell you this, Brandon, the book is poetry and prose. But until I wrote The Poet and the Sage, I was never interested in poetry, never interested in prose. Now, I had a theological upbringing because I grew up in the Mormon church, and got to know the King James Bible. You see that coming out in The Poet and the Sage because I do write in that kind of King James language, the these and the thines and thous and all that sort of stuff.
Right.
That was not a choice. It was the natural language that flowed out through the process of writing this book. I didn't choose to do that. It was something that happened, right? And so I've been very interested to see that as I wrote that book, I wasn't quite sure where it was going. And I was figuring it out as I was writing it. But then in the editing process, I kept on realizing that I had no idea what the book was over and over again, because I would constantly be, these insights from within the book would be revealed to me as I was editing it. And that's an artistic process, is you don't quite know where it's going. And even now, I've had a real hard time trying to figure out exactly how I talk to people about what's the book about, what's its purpose, why is it relevant, why is it important for our times. And I think I'm getting a little bit better at that. So if any of those questions come up, I'll at least have an answer. But I guess what I'm saying is, there is this important artistic element that I think is just so important, that teaches us about what we are as human beings, is that there's a process that is happening, and our job is to kind of allow that process to happen and to see the adventure that we go on by the end of it, I guess.
Yeah, it's sort of this weird thing, because it's like this balance between the conscious and the subconscious, right? And I know you're familiar with Jung psychology, but he had this idea,
but yes.
Only vaguely, but yes. But he had this idea of the subconscious, right? Obviously, all the things that we just don't know. And so, because you wrote the book,
or that we know on the deepest level, but don't know how to articulate. But yeah,
and that's another way of saying it. And there's so many levels to this, right? But yeah, he basically, had this idea that there's so many things that are just happening beneath the surface subconsciously, right? And so it's interesting to me because you took the decision to write this book, which is a conscious decision, but through it, you're sort of letting your subconscious take over, right? And so for me, it's kind of like you're directing roughly where you want to go, but then you're sort of closing your eyes and then putting your hand into this bag, and you don't know what's going to come out, really. And so you're starting to haul things out, and it's like you haul something out of a hat. What the hell is it? Well, I don't know. You try and figure it out afterwards. But it's almost like through creative expression, what you're doing is you're converting some of this subconscious knowledge that you have, something that you understand on a deep level, into something that's palatable and that speaks to people and speaks to yourself. And it's so interesting that it's so often in life that we know something is valuable, but we don't know why, or we can't articulate why. It's like beauty. It's like, sometimes it's like nature. It's like you're just so awestruck by the thing. And we run into issues. This is actually a big topic I want to get into with you, but we run into the issue of trying to rationalize that sometimes. So like how do you think about that? Because it's an interesting thing, isn't it? To sort of have something that's such a wonderful feeling to observe, yet we naturally just want to try and explain it and understand it, right? So where does that fit in your, particularly with your own work?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm just trying to step back and watch what's happening and try and learn as much as possible about what kind of adventure I'm currently going on. Part of that is actually listening and watching other people and how they interact with my writings. And I'll give you a few examples. I did this album called Paradisa Suite. It's my first piano album, and features a whole bunch of beautiful nature sounds from around the Sunshine Coast here where I grew up. Some singing and a very mystical kind of adventure that you go on with this music. And with that album, I released a whole bunch of poetry. Now, a few months later, after I'd released the album, I actually took the album, my photography, and my poetry to a local botanical garden and did an exhibition in their halls there. I started to notice that the people who really got my poetry and the people who would have transformative experiences, meaning they're standing there reading this poetry, in tears, and they're just, as you might say, awestruck, right? They were all Christians. And so I started to think, okay, this is teaching me a little bit about what's bubbling up from that Jungian unconscious that is just, inhabiting my creative process. And there was even a lady who said she read one of my poems, and it's a little bit prophetic. It's a little bit mystical, and talks about God. And she said, she was like a Baptist, and she said, "Do you believe this?" And I said, "I don't know how to answer that," because I haven't stepped foot in a church as worship. I've just came back from a cathedral yesterday, but not necessarily there. I was speaking to some people about possible future projects, but and I love the architecture, but I haven't been to church, so to speak, in a long time. But it just turned out that Christians were the people who got my poetry. And I'm finding the same thing with the poet and the sage, is that Christians already have, and I imagine a lot of religious people will find this, they already have that upbringing in that metaphorical tradition. And so this kind of poetry speaks to them. And even Sharon LaBelle, I'll tell you that a few weeks ago, I presented my own little inspiration session to the walled garden community that we're putting together now. And I read out this kind of what I thought was an epistle or an essay about what I wanted to contribute. And it talked about enlightenment and wisdom and virtue, how we can find these things. Not that I'm any expert at all. But at the end of it, Sharon she has this beautiful way of just dropping a truth bomb or just dropping some important piece of information and then just getting out, right? She doesn't need to use more words than necessary. I love that about Sharon. But she said, "Simon, you know what? I think what you've just read to us is a prayer." And so I'm kind of stepping back, and I'm also being influenced by the people who are interacting with my own writings and my work and everything, and saying, not what do I want to be, or what should I be, or what should I write, what should I produce, but let me learn a little bit more about what they see in what I'm doing, because perhaps that can help me to know a little bit more about what it is that I'm actually doing. And much of that has led me on this path of now, studying a Master of Divinity, realizing that I was an absolute fool who never really took religion seriously, or, the religion of my upbringing seriously, never took these questions of divinity seriously. And that's what I'm really looking to do now. And I think much of that came because I started to write through poetry and to realize that, this is now transforming me, and I have no idea where it's going, but I'm willing to go on that adventure. I don't know. That's my long rant. Anyway, I'll pause there.
That's interesting, man. It's almost like, one of the things that I think that's just fascinating about art that sort of separates it a little bit from science is that it doesn't really matter how good you are at artful expression, right? And I want to know your thoughts on this as well. But for me, it's like when I see someone, for example, that's a beginner at piano or painting, and I know, just to clarify for everyone, we're using these terms very broadly. Artists, right, can mean, musicians or anything like that. But, you see beginners and they're sort of learning, or they're just playing around, or even intermediates and they're not experts at it. It doesn't particularly matter how good they are at it. Like, all that really matters is how it makes that individual feel. And that's the wonderful thing about art, right? It's not the same with science. And the other thing that I find it separates from science is that you don't have to understand it to appreciate it. Like, for you to really appreciate how the human body works and all its complexity, like, you have to understand it. You have to really go down deep and spend a lot of time understanding it. So to gain like a real appreciation for it, for art, it's just there. The appreciation is just there. You don't need to understand it. And in fact, when you actually understand it, in some ways you actually lose a little piece of that appreciation in some ways, right? So,
well, I think there's some things that I'd agree with you. There's some things potentially not. I think certainly. I really like what Stephen Jenkinson taught me about art. And this is something that I've been rediscovering, because the purpose of an artist, what is the role that an artist plays in society? What is the role that a philosopher plays? What is the role that a musician or a poet plays? I think personally, the most growth I've seen as an artist has come after I actually learned what might be my role in society, and I never learned that at university. And that was really disappointing to me. But what Stephen Jenkinson says about it, and I think he's right, he says, true art is a public service, right? It's not self-expression. And if it becomes self-expression, then you're missing the point. It's a public service that the artist engages in, and it is only self-expression if the artist happens to live in a time where their personal problems align perfectly with the problems of the culture, right? Then it can become some sort of self-expression. But he does a better job of explaining it. And then Jordan Peterson, bring him into the picture. He talks about how the role of the artist is literally to help people to see, right? So when you read a beautiful poem that is deep and rich in symbolism and metaphor and wisdom, when you allow yourself to fall into that pit, right, it transforms you and awakens you, allows you to see something. This is why we say things like, I couldn't see this, but then when he told me this, I could see, right? Because we literally see something different. I think what's happening with my own artistic path is whether it is with my music, my podcast, my poetry, anything that I do, my photography even especially, I'm trying to get people to see something that they didn't see before. And I'll tell you this as well, like, I think that absolutely there is a place for allowing people to engage in a process that gets them to drop the guard and to express themselves and to feel something and to inhabit a new mindset as they engage in artistic creativity. Absolutely. But then I'll tell you this. So I was at the cathedral in Brisbane yesterday. I went to a few of them because I've been interested in seeing how I might potentially play some music in cathedrals and perhaps read some poetry in cathedrals, because you just go into these places and a cathedral is a work of art. It's like an icon to beauty, to awe, to this conception of God. And I stood out the front of this cathedral yesterday. It's called St. John's in Brisbane. And I looked up, and there's this whole row of these icons of the saints, I believe, or of the apostles. I really didn't actually know because it was so deep and it was so out of my reach. But in every single one of these icons, there's symbolism, and there's, above one there's a shell, above one there's there's a dove, and then above another that below one there's a skull in the ground, and that each one has its own character with all of these different elements of symbolism. And the thing about that is, like, that's art, right? But it's so deep, and what it does is it calls you in, and you think, I have no idea what any of that means, but every single one of the pieces that go in those icons means something. And then if you want to learn all of that, it's like that would take you a lifetime to learn just what those icons on the front of that cathedral mean, let alone walking into the cathedral and looking up at the rose window and the stained glass windows around, and everything calls you to look up. It's this magnificent structure, and I think that is what great art does, is it pulls you into an adventure, and it pulls you in and shows you that if you would just spend a little time, you might see something that you didn't see before. And so I don't know, like it's the role of the artist in society is so important. I think for many years, Brandon, I was quite cynical. I was one of those musicians who's, even though I did quite well, I was still cynical enough to be kind of like, yeah, people don't want to pay for music these days, and it's like, the industry is against us and all this sort of stuff. I started to realize, hang on, no, I have a responsibility as an artist to be the artist, regardless of whether or not regardless of the state of the music industry, or regardless of the state of the, regardless of the fact that pretty much every publisher has in their notes, we do not publish poetry, like regardless of that, I have to be the artist. That's my responsibility, especially when you know what purpose an artist plays in society. That's what I'd say to that.
Yeah, well, and I agree with that. But it's almost like a separate thing, because it's like a spiritual understanding that you're getting, right? It's like something deep, as opposed to it's like understanding what it means as opposed to understanding exactly what it is, right? Because you don't need to understand exactly what it is. And of course, this is what's fascinating for me, is that both science and art are sort of operate on this balancing scale between, chaos and order, between the known and the unknown. Because for you to, for example, even approach, like for you to write, there's certain skills you need to know. There's certain scientific, objective things. You need to know how to hold a pencil. You need to know how to form the letters. You need to understand language. And and in order for you to do that, it unlocks you to the adventure of discovering the unknown. And it's also the same with science. Science is exactly the same way. Like you can't really do experiments per se without a lot of fundamental knowledge that goes on before that. And so it's so interesting to me that we often think of sort of art and science as opposing things, whereas for me, I see it more as like two pillars, I suppose, that hold up human understanding, and that we eliminate one or the other at our extreme peril. And I think you can certainly attest to that. And you mentioned that when you were younger, you had this sort of feeling towards artists. And I mean, I did an engineering degree, so we made fun of art students, right? We made fun of our students. I hate to say that, but we did. It was like, oh, you guys aren't going to get jobs and this and that, and how much of that was out of insecurity, I don't know. But it was sort of this running joke to sort of crap on artists. And for me now, looking back, I certainly recognize the role that art plays, even though it's a very difficult life, generally speaking. I mean, I know that's a very extreme opinion.
Gird your loins. Yeah.
It can be tough.
I'm waiting for that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it can be tough because like you mentioned about the monetizing it, and, there's certain practical limitations on the world that we live in, right? And so it can be hard. And I think, it's also, I mean, this is actually an interesting thing. Maybe we can talk about this a little bit. How a lot of artists, especially the ones that are extremely brilliant, a lot of them aren't particularly happy. Like they don't have like you would say flourishing lives. And so it's an interesting thing, because it's not like just because you're an artist, you're like, just in the state of eudaimonia. It's not the case, right? So like, what do you think of that? Like, or what do you make of that? It's an interesting conundrum.
Well, I got three things that I want to talk about based on what you just said, because, man, you brought up some really interesting points. Firstly, this idea that that we need to have that foundation, of perhaps our education needs to be at a level commensurate with our artistic ability in order to truly turn it into something. So, if you want to write poetry, you should probably learn the language, and you should probably learn it well. And I think that this is something that every artist will struggle with, and this is perhaps fundamental to the artistic journey, is, does my skill match the ambition of my project? And that's something I'm trying to figure out as well. Even with the Walled Garden, this thing that I'm putting together with Sharon and Kai, part of the Walled Garden is me saying, okay, if I'm going to choose the life of the artist, I want my I want to do it in such, I want to raise my ability to actually get these messages out to people, and I want to do it in a way that brings people in on that adventure. So I'm trying to kind of raise the, you could say the business side of my artistic journey by saying, let's figure out a way that this works for everybody, so that I can be the artist and I can present that to people who want to hear it. It's part of the podcast as well. But yeah, it's always that challenge, and I think everybody deals with this. It's something that Jordan Peterson puts like this. He says, "Are you as educated as you are intelligent?" it would be good if those two things kind of rose together. The other point that you made, and I thought this is really interesting. You talked about science and art being the two pillars that if you remove one, it kind of ruins things. Man, I took a photo yesterday. You'll like this. I think I took a photo that demonstrates what happens when science takes place of art. and I was walking around the city, and I was walking through this Anzac Memorial, this war memorial through the city, and there's this beautiful building on one side, and it's this beautiful architecture, these Victorian windows and really kind of fancy sides and everything. It's just gorgeous, right? But then behind that, if you look in right behind it, there's this big brutalist architecture building from the 80s or something, just cement, nasty, black and gray, nothing inspiring about it whatsoever. So I took a photo of this to demonstrate, like, that building behind this beautiful Victorian building, that's what happens when the artistic side of the community falls away. And I understand that at the time, it's perhaps not even that the artists fall away. It's perhaps that is a representation of the national soul of artistry at that point in time. And so I'm always thinking about that when you walk around, especially in a place like Australia, where we don't have we're not old enough to have been influenced greatly by that earlier magnificent, virtuous architecture. And so there's a lot of ugliness around. And so, when you walk around a city like Brisbane, you'll come across these gorgeous buildings, but every so often you'll just be like, what is this? I hate it. I mean, even I'm going on a bit of a rant here, but even at the cathedral, there was another cathedral I went to yesterday, St. Stephen's. Beautiful cathedral. One of the oldest buildings in Brisbane. Stone and everything. It's just gorgeous. But then I think it was in the 80s or 90s, some famous brutalist architect who actually also developed the Performing Arts Centre there came along and added something to the end of the cathedral. It's an extra prayer room or something like that. And it's like this brutalist mess attached to this gorgeous sacred architecture. and I thought, this is what happens, when the soul goes down that direction. Now, you asked another question at the end there. I'm going to have to get you to clarify in that.
Which one? I can't remember. Sorry.
Oh man, there was that final point that you made that was important. I just had to go back to those two. Okay. We'll see where it comes back in, because I'm not going to remember it right now.
I'm sure it'll circle back. There is something I wanted to explore a little bit with you, and this is, because you mentioned that sort of balance between proficiency at the skill and the ability to sort of engage in that artistic function. Here's something interesting, though. I don't know what to make of this, but I've been playing guitar since I was 9. I think I mentioned it to you personally, but you've been playing guitar since I could hold one, essentially. Been playing piano now for about 3 to 4 years, so I'm still pretty intermediate at it, and I haven't really formally learned. For me, it's sort of like this enjoyment. I like listening to it. But I found something interesting. I found that in terms of creative expression, I find it a little bit easier with the piano, despite my lack of proficiency, and I actually think that is a benefit in some way. So it's this weird thing. Now, obviously, there's a limit to that, right? Like it can't be Beethoven. I don't have the skill enough to extend that. But I don't think it's. I think you're right in that, and Peterson is right, I guess, in terms of the proficiency and how far you can push that. But I don't think that that's necessarily, or that it's arbitrarily a good thing. You know what I mean? I know it's a weird thing. I'm trying to figure it myself, but it's almost like there are certain emotions and feelings that I hit with the piano due to my lack of proficiency that I don't think I could hit with the guitar, even though I'm so much more, dude, they're not even on the same level. I'm so much more proficient at the guitar. So it's weird, isn't it? I don't know. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's Yeah, we've had some very similar experiences. This is interesting. I think choosing an instrument is very much like that scene in Harry Potter where the kids go in to pick their wand, but the wand picks them. Really, it's like this is the right one.
Right.
So let me kind of demonstrate this through an experience that I've had, and perhaps you'll relate to this. And when I was younger, I really loved piano, and I would sit at the piano and I'd just improvise and I'd make songs up. I wasn't good, right? Definitely wasn't good, but the feeling was there and the excitement that was there, the adventure was there. So my parents, being the amazing parents that they were, they put me in piano lessons. But the thing is, I just had a different spirit about me, and I went in and this was like a classical teacher. And so it was like, play these notes at this time and go and practice this and practice that. And I hated it. And so after a few lessons, I gave up piano, right? And it wasn't until I've noodled around on the piano my whole life, only little bits, and maybe I knew some chords and stuff, but nothing good. Then last year, I decided, I think I walked into my local music store and there was this beautiful Korg piano there, and it was way above any price range that I had definitely not given to buy myself a piano, but it was one of those Wayne's World "She Will Be Mine" moments. And so I kind of just said, I'm going to get it, because I'm not just a jazz trumpeter, which is what I was trained as, and I'm not just a jazz singer. No, I'm a musician, and if I really want to play piano, like, this instrument's choosing me. Like, I've come in here, I love this instrument, I'm going to get it. And that was one of the best decisions I made, because what I found is that after about 6 months of having that piano, I had practiced piano more than I'd practiced singing or trumpet playing in my entire life, and I had a degree in those, instruments. And so I was able to progress really quickly on piano because it clicked with me. Like, it's an instrument that I find deep resonance with, that I wouldn't find on clarinet, that I wouldn't find on other instruments. And so that just taught me that, like, as an artist, you have to trust that it's like you have to have a really egotistical belief in your subconscious mind that is giving you this intuition to do certain things and to go certain places and to play certain instruments.
Right.
And I think that's what I'm figuring out at the moment, is like, what are my weapons of choice, or what are the weapons that are choosing me? Poetry and prose. My dad is a beautiful poet. Even though I never read a lot of poetry, he writes beautiful poetry about our family. So it makes sense to me that that's naturally a language that kind of picked me at this point in my life and said, this is how you're going to write. Great. That's a weapon of choice now. The same thing happened with piano. That's a weapon of choice now. And now I'm moving on to the didgeridoo, which is one of the oldest instruments known to man. It's the sacred instrument of the Aboriginal people in Australia. But that was actually my first instrument that I played, because there was a point when I was younger when I was really, I loved the Aboriginal culture and the art and everything. You'll see some behind me, actually. So I decided to buy this didgeridoo. And I've found that as I've started to get to know the instrument more, things are happening, like it's moving in the right direction because the instrument calls out to me and I accept the call to put my trust in that. So, and I think the same thing will happen for you if you find that naturally you are able to express yourself better on the piano. If that's the instrument that calls out to you, so to speak, you got to trust that process. We've got to learn how to actually trust our deepest intuitions, as opposed to rationalizing them and saying, well, I'm actually way better on, guitar, so I should stick with that. No. Trust that if you're being pulled into that experience with that instrument, perhaps there's an adventure that you might miss if you decide to just rationalize that, well, this is what I'm better at. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I absolutely agree. And actually, I did that because that instrument of choice was guitar for me for a long time, a very long time. So absorbed into the guitar, played until my fingers bled, kind of classic thing, right? And then it reached a point where I began to lose challenge. Now, I'm not Jimi Hendrix or anything like that. I know that I could have pushed that farther, but I think these sort of areas of challenge in our lives, it's all relative, right? It's like, how much are you willing to push? So yeah, I totally agree with that. You have to, whatever's calling you into action. And I had a similar experience when I would go into a music store with the piano. For years, I would go in and I didn't know anything. I knew how to play a C chord. So I would go in and I would just sit down and play the C chord, and I would, diddle a little bit with it. And it was always just amazing. And eventually, of course, I bought one, but there's this other, I'll tell you a weird experience that I had similar to that.
Do.
Maybe this will hit something home. This happened just a couple months ago. A friend was visiting me, and he's engineer type, and he's more of an engineer, I would say, than I am. And I mean that he's more of a scientist is a better way of saying it, in terms of how he thinks. He's not very artsy. He's not really into music in the way that I guess we are in terms of creative expression. But it was interesting because he said he was really into classical music. And now I've never really been into classical music, but and he made the point that there's no music today that's created on the same level as classical music. And I obviously had to object to that, right? Because this was when it's going to get interesting. But so this is when Adele's latest song just came out, "Go Easy on Me," right? Which everyone just fell in love with. And that song for me, very simple, very simple. It's just a piano. Adele singing, obviously she's an amazing singer. The emotion in her voice, how everything flows together. I'm sure you've heard the song, but it's just an amazing song, and so philosophically deep, so psychologically deep. And so he didn't hear it, so he played it, and he said, "Okay, well, yeah, but I mean, like, it's so simple." And like, to me, I was looking at it like how it makes me feel and the depth of it from a spiritual perspective. What it got down to is what he was talking about is the level of, how would you say it? It's like the amount of engineering and math that went into and goes into writing classical music. Because for classical music, it seemed to be the case, the way he described it to me, is it's more of a mathematician who happens to play music. And so he's writing in a sense that's very complicated and very complex, and there's thought gone into everything, very strategic engineering, systematic thought gone into creating this masterpiece. And so it really, really hit home for me, because it was just so interesting, because I've never thought about that. Like, here we had, very simple music for me, which always draws me in, like, an acoustic guitar and one person singing, a piano and one person singing, just the piano. That stuff for me always just drew me in from a spiritual sense. But he was looking at it from an engineering sense. So it's almost like science can find its expression in art. And I think that the opposite is true too, because I see scientists that actually can express science in an artful form. It's sort of this weird paradox, isn't it? This weird balancing in between, again, what I think are like the two pillars of I guess our world.
Yeah, you're speaking to something extremely important here, which is that, your rationalization of why this music or that music is the best music doesn't hold up against the felt value of that music. Something that I really learned from Rob Simonson. He's a beautiful pianist and film score composer. And I had him on the show, and we had this great conversation talking about how a lot of young students, when they're at the end of their university, what they think music is about is getting up on stage and playing as many notes as technically efficient as possible, fast, loud, let me just get up there and shred it, as they would say, especially in the jazz circles. It's about shredding it. But he just said, it was never about that for me. It's about, does it feel right? Does it, does it touch you in some sort of way? And that's really what music can show us, is that Well, let me say it like this. Like, I think you can make a perfectly reasonable argument that classical music, symphonic music, gives us the most pure picture of perhaps what music could be, like the virtue of music, because what classical music is and what symphonic music is, it's layers upon layers upon layers upon layers upon layers, all these different instruments coming together in a harmony that all of them individually contribute something that as a whole is greater than any individual part. And that's a picture of life. Like, that's a picture of what we want our lives to be. We want every part of our life to stack up in this beautiful hierarchy that leads to a harmony that is greater than any individual part in our lives, right? And that's what music is as well. But then what can happen is somebody can come out with, I think it was Birdie who did like Skinny Love. It's like this, recording of this old rickety piano, and, this vocal, and that just takes the world by storm. And that's not layers upon layers upon layers upon layers. I mean, that's 2 layers, but there's probably more than that metaphysically. But yeah, the point being that, artists really have this opportunity to to speak to that part of the human soul that is not interested in the rationalization of whether this or that, which is why I personally cannot read intellectual articles breaking down music. Mm-hmm. I can't. Yeah. I just can't do it. It bores the crap out of me. But yeah, music and art, these things teach us what our lives could be, and the way that it teaches us that so often is through feeling. And I think that's important, especially like in a philosophy like Stoicism, where people are so obsessed with this term reason, even though most of us don't even recognize that what they meant by reason, with all the translation differences and everything back in the ancient times, was a lot more akin to God, or universal law, logos, than some sort of hyper rationalization of what is the best music or not. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's important for us to learn this so that we can just drop the defenses and say, which music right now is really speaking on a deep level to my soul, and that's that's important to know.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating to me because we actually tried to play a song together after that, and we approached it from 2 different lenses in the same way that we had that discussion. Because I come from the East Coast of Canada, and we have kitchen parties. That's what we do on the weekends. We get a guitar. Normally an acoustic guitar, one person's playing, everyone's singing. Probably sounds like crap, to be honest, a lot of the time, because everyone's half drunk, you're drinking, but it doesn't matter because it's like this community thing, and everyone's so involved into it, and the amount of feeling and emotion is unparalleled for me personally. But so when we tried to play a song together, we tried to play Let It Be by the Beatles, and I sort of had my way of playing it, which is definitely not accurate to the song, but it's the way that I find expression in that song. But I was on the guitar, he was on the piano, and he was trying to get like the exact perfection, like let's get the notes out, let's get the proper scale. And it was such a learning thing for me, as a musician and as a person in general. I did want to go to that, what you were talking about in terms of Stoicism, because I feel like this is something that a lot of people get an initial, reaction about Stoicism, and a lot of people sort of back away from it because of this. There's this notion that if you're a Stoic, you're emotionless, you're a rock, you're like, basically you're trying to be a robot, right? Robo envy. So I know you've sort of gone through some transformations with your branding in terms of, you used to be the Practical Stoic, now you're more the Walled Garden. I know you still resonate obviously with a lot of the Stoic teachings and principles, and obviously you talk to Kai Whiting quite a bit on your podcast, so it's still a huge part of your life, either directly or indirectly. But like, what do you think of that? What's your response to someone, like, say, if they're coming up to you and saying, listen, like, I'm interested in Stoicism, but like, I also like color in my life. I also like having pretty flowers in my house. You know what I mean? Like, how do you sort of approach that? What do you think about that?
Well, the first thing I tell them is that I'm not an expert on Stoicism. So my approach would be different to, say, if they went up to somebody like Dirk Marling, for example. I love Dirk, and one of the reasons I love Dirk is he's the kind of person who, if you don't really understand the core elements of Stoicism, he'll call you out for it and he'll tell you why you're wrong. I love that. I think we need that. We need a lot more of that, because a lot of people will say, hey, Stoicism's my thing, without understanding what it is. That's what I did. That's definitely what I did when I started the podcast, is very ignorant search, but I've tried to rectify that over time. But what I would tell people is probably what I tell all of my clients. One of the first things that I tell people is, I'm not going to give you a 10-step guide of how to become a Stoic and how to live your life. If you break down Stoicism to its absolute core, you start to find some structural narratives, right? These narratives that permeate every part of the philosophy. Things like considering the sage. What does it mean that the Stoics were so obsessed with conceptualizing what the sage is, right? Well, it's an abstract way of saying what is the highest possible good that we could attain, or that we could at least endeavor to obtain. That's an adventure. And so what I try to say to people is, like, try to go on an adventure seeking the highest possible good. Whether you call that the sage, whether you call that Christ, it doesn't matter. Well, it does, because the devil's in the details, right? And so, of course, like, if your highest possible good is like Hitler, devil's in the details, right? But what I try to encourage people to do is, like, let's explore the philosophy, fine, right? Let's see how all the pieces fit together, because they do fit together beautifully. But more importantly than these statements of belief in this certain philosophy or ideology or religion or anything, I'm interested, are you seeking the highest possible good that you could be going after in your life? And what would it mean to do that? And even things like, in Stoicism, you see this other core narrative flowing through of, say, amor fati, love your fate. Well, what does that mean for us, really? Like, how can we allow this principle to transform the way that we see the world? To me, it seems as though a principle like that is very akin to what you might hear, for example, when I was growing up. I was always taught in the Mormon religion, follow God's plan for you. Or in other words, actually, this is a better way of putting it. People would always say, when you're going through a trial in life, when something bad is happening to you, bad, quote unquote, see what benefit you could take away from it. They would say, see what God is trying to teach you. Okay, it's almost exactly the same thing as saying love your fate. Whatever comes your way, no matter what it is, pause in your life and say, how can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? So I try to be flexible enough to give people that freedom to go on their own adventure. And also kind of, I try to adhere to the philosophical principles just enough that we get to explore them and see whether or not there's some validity to them. And I think, Brandon, there's one more thing I would want to say. I think today there is far too much, and I've done this a lot, which is why I know that there's far too much, right? Because I've contributed to this problem. There's far too much, hey, this is the exact right philosophy, and this is right for everybody, and this is for you. I've asked, like, Massimo Pigliucci, so why isn't Stoicism right for everybody? Like, I've asked people that question. Man, there's so much wisdom of the ages out there, right? And I think the way that I look at it now is you can... Okay, I'm going to try and get this idea across in a way that doesn't sound like I'm a psychopath. The way that I'm conceptualizing my kind of adventure in life at the moment is very much like a tree, with me as the kind of seed in the center, growing both ways, up and down, right? So if you look at time, perhaps history is the roots. Philosophy of the ages is the roots. That's the roots of our culture. It's the roots of who I am. I cannot be without, the the Mormon ancestors who set up that religion who raised me, or the wonderful Stoic philosophers who decided, like Seneca, he says, I'm writing these letters for the future generation that they might have something to hold on to. I would not be who I am right now without these incredible roots that I get to explore. We get to explore history, philosophy, religion, science. We get to explore all these things. But the roots are so dense, so far-reaching, so deep, that for any one of us to explore all of them, it's like impossible. So what you need to do is you need to learn how to trust your intuitions that are telling you to go down certain paths on these routes. Trust them with a good framework so that you know when you're going into some rotted routes, right? Because there are rotted routes down these paths. But, do a little bit of deep digging and go on your own little adventure, through these routes and see what you find. You might not be interested in Heraclitus or in Seneca. I am, personally. You might not be interested in Jung, or you might be interested in Nietzsche, or you might be interested... There's all kinds of interesting adventures you can go on. But then those routes are going to turn into, the canopy. And the canopy is what you bring to this adventure that we're all on in life. The canopy is, okay, well, now that you've taken these roots here, how are they going to nourish what you do now? Whether that's in your family, your career, your occupation, your religious communities, whatever it is, your job is to, continue the growth of that tree that we're all a part of. And so I'm kind of on that adventure, and I encourage people to do the same, is don't just look at Stoicism as the one final solution for everything. It's much more interesting when you go on an adventure rather than just sitting in this one place and saying, this is it. Do you know what I mean?
Oh man, I know exactly what you mean. And that was very well said. And actually, I think this is one of the reasons I think why, some people are drawn to my style and a lot of people are not drawn to my style, for maybe for the same reason. But
I get it, man. No, I'm just kidding. Please go.
I get it too, man. Trust me. No, but it's very rare that I sit down and I go, okay, we're going to talk about Epictetus's dichotomy of control. Like, this is the topic for today. Normally what I do is I sort of explore an area that I'm trying to figure out intellectually, or basically something I'm going through myself. And I sort of throw in a lot of random things into the mix and create something resembling what I think is something close to truth. I don't know, right?
Yeah.
But sort of that's the process. Now that turns a lot of people off though, because a lot of people come to Stoicism or any philosophy and they're looking for like what do I do, right? So I'm very aware of the fact that this doesn't apply to anyone, or to everyone. But I just think that, I guess, to get back to what you said, what I'm trying to replicate is that journey. It's like our conversation right now, we had no idea what we were going to talk about today, right? This isn't like you didn't show up here and I have like 20 questions on a paper. And there's nothing wrong with that style of interview. I'm not dissing anyone for doing that. But for me, I'm trying to sort of replicate that adventure that you're talking about, at least my particular adventure, which is the only one I really have access to. But it's definitely an interesting thing. And you run the risk. Like, for example, we came into this conversation not having any idea where it was going to go. We had some rough idea, but not really. So it's not like you come back with a textbook and you say, okay, this is what we're going to talk about. And you say your part, I'll say mine. So in this exploratory phase, what's interesting is I wouldn't say it's easy, but there's the risk of going in the wrong direction, or there's the risk of falling off path. And so, and it's hard to recognize. So how do you even know that? Like, how do you feel that? And I think part of it is accepting that you're going to do it sometimes.
Yeah.
And so when you have, because I know you do coaching, you talk to all kinds of people, like when you're talking to someone that sort of, maybe they're not sure they're going down the wrong path. They followed what they thought was their interest, what called them, and maybe it's not going the path that they choose. How do you deal with that, and that quitting nature, or starting something new, or that sort of transition in life? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, you make many interesting points about the podcaster's journey as well, because it's so much fun. It's fun to go on that adventure of not quite knowing what's going to happen next, but we're just going to have a conversation and see what we both learn from each other, right? And I think that that's something that really changed the way that I look at what I'm doing, and it's one of the reasons why I changed to the Walled Garden. It was a natural progression of the Practical Stoic podcast, because I kind of thought, hey, if we go through seasons in our lives, right? And if 20 years on, I'm still just talking about the dichotomy of control, something's wrong. Something's wrong. I haven't pushed myself. I haven't exerted myself in this effort to discover wisdom, to discover what virtue is, to actually bring something of value to the world. We need to break, right? And then we need to rebuild ourselves. And hopefully what is rebuilt is stronger than what you were before you were broken. The same thing happens in my music. It's very strange. Like with my piano playing, my style tends to be, I will sit down and improvise, and things will break and it'll get very chaotic, right? And to the average listener, it will just sound terrible. They'll be like, what am I listening to? This is horrible. But then it's in that brokenness that I try to rebuild, right? And see if I can find my way back up to a state of eudaimonic bliss in a meditative theme in the piano, and then it turns into something just gorgeous and turns into something that inspires, right? But this is also the same story that's told in the Bible. It's like deserts and gardens. You start in a garden, right? And then you fall into a desert. Now, what do? Okay, now we're wandering in a desert for all this time, struggling our way back up to God in the garden, and then we're in the garden again. And then we get prideful because we're in the garden and we fall again, and now we're in the desert again. And the same thing can happen in your thinking, as long as you've constantly got at the back of your mind, what am I not seeing here? What am I not feeling here? What is the ultimate thing that I'm searching for here? And so I think that it's about those. You ask, okay, well, you actually said something there that I thought was appropriate. You've said many things that I think are appropriate, but this particular thing, you said, how do you feel that, right? And so this is the thing I've been trying to teach people is, I'm trying to learn myself. And so in Seneca's way, where he says, I'm just a patient in the same hospital, we've both got illness of the soul. Let's see if we can figure this out together. I'm trying to figure out, how do you get as unadulterated a relationship with the feeling of virtue and rightness and beauty and wisdom, So not how can we rationalize at any one moment, that this is wisdom or that's not wisdom or this is, but how do we learn how to feel our way around, because I believe that is a deeper, I believe that is a deeper communication that we can listen to, in the same way that, we all know when we've done something that is shameful, because you do feel that. Now, of course, there's a little bit of cultural element there in terms of what we've been raised to shame. But I wouldn't go as far as to say that that's the whole thing. I think that deep down we know when we're doing something shameful, when there's a habit. Jordan Peterson puts it like this, and I think this is one of the best things that I ever learned in my life. He said, this is what prayer is. You sit beside your bed and you ask yourself, what are some of the terrible things that I'm doing in my life that I know that if I keep on doing these things, it's going to lead to terrible results in the future. You'll get I get 10 answers immediately. If I ask that question, I get 10 answers like this, and this. These are the things that you need to stop immediately. Otherwise, you're going to have some drastic, you're going to have some harsh times ahead if you don't stop doing these habits, right? And so, that's the feeling that I'm trying to understand. It's like, how do we not only hear that call, how do we not only feel our way through that, but then how do we, I think heed is the right word. How do we heed to that call of a better self, of a better life, of a better way of being? And so, yeah, I think that absolutely you're right. You know, it's a difficult problem, and that's kind of what I'm trying to solve at the moment. I don't know, like how do you think about these things?
Well, see, I think about it. I think that there's a huge importance to what's calling you, right? And we spoke about that quite a bit, but I think it has to be balanced with responsibility,
Yes.
right? Because, you know, and this might sound so obvious, but there's things in life you just have to do. And actually, I take that back. It's not so obvious because a lot of people aren't really understanding this today. We want our cake, and eat it too, kind of thing. But like, there's certain things in life that you have to just do, and you're probably not going to want to do it. Like, take out the trash, do the dishes, probably go to work. And so it's almost like, you know, what I've encouraged people to do is, you know, if there's something calling you, like, first of all, there's things you need to do. There's things you need to do. There's responsibilities in life, and you, maybe those responsibilities, we can eliminate some of them because they're not actual responsibilities. They're just things you're taking on voluntarily. But there's things in life you need to do. And if you actually are disciplined about those things and focus on doing that as good as you can, it opens the opportunity for you to be called into something from a passionate side. Because I think you'd be fooling yourself to think that you can just go through life and always do what's calling you, right? Maybe you could, because eventually you get hungry and you'd have to go look for some food, right?
Yeah.
You know,
and
what
maybe
I mean?
you have to be a fool in order to live that kind of life.
And maybe you do.
Yeah.
But I do think this is something that people struggle with, because it's almost like this sort of this idealistic communist idea, which is like, you know, everyone can do what they want. And it's like, okay, well, who's going to bring in the firewood? Because nobody wants to do that. And I can damn well tell you, you know, I grew up in Canada with a wood stove. You don't bring in the firewood, it's going to be a cold night. Yeah. So, I don't know. What's that ringing for you? Like, balancing the responsibility, but also encouraging people to go after what they love in life.
Well, I think you're right. And one thing that I never want people to take away from what I say is that you should just, you know, quote unquote, follow your bliss, you know. Just do what makes you happy all the time. It's certainly not about that. I think the way that I feel about it is that, of course, we have to balance that responsibility, and you have to accept responsibility for what is yours to take responsibility for. Of course, in something like Christianity, for example, the sage of Christianity, Christ, is the person who decides to, maybe not decides, comes along and does take responsibility for all of the evils of the world. It's like, that's crazy. You know, what if you could do that? That's insane. But I also think that if you're a person who has a window of opportunity to truly invest in that adventure that calls out to you, if you have a window of opportunity where, you know, things are kind of lining up, where you've got time, you know, you've got resources to actually go after this, and this is taking responsibility for what you have. Often in these conversations, we talk a lot about people who perhaps, you know, are stuck with a lot of, you know, it might be familial responsibilities, it might be financial responsibilities, perhaps fallen on hard times, and they have to take responsibility for those parts of their lives. We also need to have the conversation about the people who do have a lot, you know, who have a very fortunate position in life. I think if you have a very fortunate position in life, and many of us do, even though we might not realize it, then do you have a responsibility to take that good fortune and invest it in a true calling, something that you believe could contribute to your community, your culture, the world, in a way that would be so much better than just sitting there with all of your good fortune, you know? Mm-hmm. And I don't mean in the modern sense of, you know, taking responsibility for your good fortune as in going out on social media and declaring your privilege. It's like, that does nothing, right? I'm talking about take what you have, take the blessings that you have, take the good fortune that has been bestowed upon you, right? Whether it is through your hard work or whether it is just through good fortune, and invest it in something that is going to truly be transformative for you and for other people. in your community, I think that we have that responsibility. I think that is such an important element that we perhaps don't talk about enough, because we are so focused on, well, what if I fall on hard times with my family or something like that, which is very important to talk about. But yeah, I think that's what I think resonates with me at this point in my life, is that I think I have a window of opportunity where there are just enough people who are supporting what I do, just enough people who are, further along on this path but are encouraging me, just enough resources, just enough of everything for me to say, okay, if I don't try and go on this adventure wholeheartedly, I believe I would be not contributing as fully as I could to this culture that I love. That's kind of what that spikes up for me.
Yeah, I mean, I resonate with that a lot, man. Like, I really do. It's. I feel the same thing. I feel like, I feel privileged in many ways. I mean, my day job at the moment, I work very hard. When I work hard, some days are a little slow, and for me, it's like I feel this responsibility to bear my damn cross. Pick up a book, learn something, share it, invest in terms of labor, work on the podcast, work on ideas. I recently decided to start doing a little bit of free consultations with coaching, with strength coaching, because I'm a strength coach. And so I said, well, hey, there's lots of teenagers out there that can't afford coaching. I get a couple hours every now and then. Let me do this. And this has been, and I'm not saying that as virtue signaling, but for me, it's something that's, what interests me is what you do for free when you have all your needs met. And that's, for me, that's what owning your responsibility in life first allows you to do. And maybe it's not the end goal, but for most people are in this category, right? They're working a full-time job and they have other interests, they have other passions. And for me, it's like get your basics right. Do the things you need to do at home, do the work you need to do at work. And if you can do that and meet your basic needs, then that opens the possibility of, okay, what do I do with my free time? What do I do with my free time? And when you're in that position with no financial restrictions, with no other restrictions of any kind, it's really interesting to me what you choose to do with that.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's what I'm interested in at the moment. That's what I'm sort of after. So I definitely resonate with that, man. That's good stuff.
Well, another interesting thing about what you say there is, even like you take care of those responsibilities, but then perhaps you have a little bit of time at the end of the day. Okay, what do you do with that time? One thing that I often find, and I find this with myself as well, it's like, let's say you want to get healthy. You set this arbitrary goal of, okay, I'm going to run 30 minutes a day. But let's say you only have 5 minutes to do something, or 10 minutes to do something. Often we'll say, well, I can't do 30, so I'm not going to do the 10, right? We might not say that, but that's what happens, which means that's what we believe, right? And so I often say to people, even if all you can do is like 5 minutes of something, I'd say this to people when they would come and join the gym, when I was managing a gym. I'd say, listen, if all you do this week is come in here and talk to me for 5 minutes, like, great. I just want you to come into the gym. That's what I want. Because once you're here, likely you're going to do something. And even if you do a little bit of something, that's better than a whole lot of nothing. Right. So, I think that gives people a little bit of freedom as well to say, okay, yeah, maybe I only have like 10 minutes in my day, to start working on my craft or working on what I believe is a calling for me. Brilliant. Just utilize what you can. And this is a lot of what Stoicism is about, right? It's like, how can we utilize to the best of our abilities what little we might have? How can we find the gold amongst the dirt? I think that hopefully people will take that and think, yeah, maybe I do have 5 or 10 minutes a day just to work on something, and maybe that's enough for now,
Yeah. Well, what particularly motivates me to do that, even if it's 5 minutes, even if it's 10 minutes, and you'd rather do an hour, is I always think back on this principle that I can't find any proof that it's not true, and I wish it weren't true, but it seems to be. And that's the case, that everything in life the natural state of everything in life is regression, right? Like we tend to think that like everything's sort of, we're like this and like we're flat. And if we don't do anything, we're going to stay where we are. It's not true. I mean, if anyone that's been to the gym, if you don't go to the gym for a couple of weeks, you don't stay in the same place. You go backwards. And so, and this has been huge for my strength coaching too, because some people, you reach certain points where you're not making the progress that you want for whatever reason. Maybe you're stressed at work. Maybe the program, hopefully I didn't write it, but maybe the program is crap. But then I always implore people, it's like, what's the alternative, man? Like, yeah, maybe you're just as strong. That's progress. If you're in the same place now, like, it's like Alice in Wonderland, that quote, you have to sprint in place to stay, you have to sprint to stay in the same place. And that's kind of what life is. And I know that's not an optimistic outlook, but for me, I use that as encouragement, because it's like, I have 5 minutes. Well, I could do nothing, or I could do 5 minutes, and I still might regress, but I'm not going to regress as much. Yeah. So it's just a little way to sort of motivate you, to get you up and moving. Something's better than nothing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's just, that dose of truth is just so important, right? That everything, the natural state is for it to decay, to fall away, to, and so, but also the flip side of that, which I think is equally important, is go on your adventure looking through history and, the wisdom of the ages, the wisdom of our ancestors, and you'll find people who got so good at fighting against that regression, that constant regression. They got so good at overcoming that natural state of life that they just became world beaters. They just became these giants among men, who would come along and just completely change the course of history. And that's all in your DNA. Like, that's all, that's who you are. I often go to Jordan Peterson because I've just been, in the same way that Seneca says you should pick a teacher who you believe has some sort of unquestionable genius, not unquestionable in terms of there's never going to be something that he says is wrong, but that there's a level of thought there that you have not yet attained that you would like to, right? I've been spending that amount of time with Peterson's work, and one point that he makes is he says, every single one of your ancestors was successful at reproduction and made it through life just enough to pass on their genes to that. Yeah. You are the son or daughter of a long line of absolute badasses. You're of warriors, of builders, of incredible people who survived against circumstances which you may never even taste. Like the things that our ancestors went through. This is one of the reasons where, and I should note before I say this, I know I mention the Mormon Church a lot. I'm not necessarily associated with the church anymore, but I still find it very culturally meaningful. One of the things that they always taught us was like, hey, here's all these stories of our pioneers who came before us, who took their wagons and their little food that they had and journeyed across the states into the West to find this place called, Salt Lake Valley, and, to build a city there. Like the Mormons are very industrious people, and they have a strong history of people who were willing to go up against the elements for what they believed, right? To really just be like, I believe it was only recently, it was only in the late 1900s that a law was changed that basically said that you could go out and shoot Mormons. There was a law in some states in America that said you could literally you could kill Mormons. So anyway, the point being, that was an important part of my upbringing, was them teaching us like, hey, this is what you're capable of because this is what they did. And they would take us out to farms and we'd go pull wagons around for days in the cold and everything. It's like, but the point is like, yeah, life is tough. It's going to be tough. But you need to know that you're made of the sort of stuff that is able to go up against this. Then you're not naive to your strengths and also the inevitable weaknesses of life. and that's a beautiful gift. That's a beautiful gift. And then we need to take responsibility for that and give it our best, I guess, which is a whole nother discussion.
Well, as an extension of that, and maybe this would be the last little topic we cover here, but because I sensed this a little bit in when you were talking about your writing this book, The Poet and the Sage, and this is something that everyone struggles with, I think, and that's when you're called in to do something, and let's say it's something like greatness. You can define that however you want: great husband, great wife, CEO, however you want to define it. There's also this little voice in your head that's like, no, this is an ego thing, right? And I think everyone struggles with this that goes after anything. I mean, I know I struggle with this. I'll see what you say, but I kind of sense when you were writing, it's almost like this thing where, okay, I have something to offer to the world, but do I really? Do I really have something to offer to the world, or is this just an egotistical thing? And it's like, for me, it's almost like that balances out your ego, right? So I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. Even though it sucks, because I feel this thing too, this sort of pull to get your feet back on the ground where they belong when your head starts blowing up. But like, how do you consult people that maybe are struggling with that piece, that maybe don't feel like they have anything of value to offer to the world?
That is a tough one, because I think that here's what I'd say to that. Of course, if when I think about my own kind of adventure that I'm going on, there is an element of that grandiose kind of like, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to speak to people on a podcast and I'm going to try and aim at the highest good and I'm going to try and bring people on. I'm going on a certain adventure that has been afforded to me, that has been depends on what you believe, that I've been led down this adventure based on many elements in my life, including the extremely privileged upbringing that I had. And I don't mean privileged in terms of the way it's often used today. I mean, I'm grateful for the fact that I had a strong family to grow up in. I had, a lot of resources at my disposal to, even when I think of the school that I went to, they thought about how they could encourage the light that shined within certain students and bring that out as much as possible. I'm so grateful that I had people like that constantly. But that no matter what small contribution or big contribution you're giving to the world, it can make a huge difference. I want to give this example. I did a gig recently for this event out at this holiday village out near where I live. And so it's this little charity event there. And so I was playing with another pianist and doing some beautiful music for the evening. And there was this young girl who was kind of taking care of us as the musicians. She was helping us get our equipment across on a little buggy and everything. And she worked for the organization. And so she was kind of the liaison between the event planners and the musicians and the people who were there. Now, this girl, she was in a pretty standard position within the organization. But man, she was so kind, so helpful, so her soul was shining through that you could not be around her and not feel like, man, she's one of the best people I've ever met. Like, she so helpful, so nice, so kind. The way that she spoke to my pianist, he's an elderly gentleman, and the way that she helped him and nourished her position that she had at that point. And I said to her at the end of the night, I was like, you're one of the nicest people, one of the best people I've ever met, right? And the reason I said that was because like she's the kind of person who, no matter what position she's doing, no matter where she is, she's going to lift the energy wherever she is. She's going to lift the people around her. And I love that. And what that really teaches me, and this happens all the time. It's like you're checking out and the checkout person there, gives you a smile or says a kind word. It's like, wow, the difference that can make is unbelievable. And I like to recognize those things from time to time, because what it shows me is like, they can do things that I probably can't even do sometimes with their attitude and, the way that they approach their work. And so I think that certainly humility, certainly gratitude for whatever contribution you get to add to the world, but just a willingness to accept that no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, you have the opportunity in that moment and in that place to make things better. Jim Rohn, he put it like this: become a person who adds value wherever you go. If you can become a person who adds value in everything you do, with every person you meet, with every place that you visit, that is, man, you will make yourself so unbelievably valuable as a person that people will want to be around you. So I think I would just encourage everybody, like, it doesn't matter what adventure you're going on right now in your life, you have the opportunity in every place to contribute at a higher and higher level, so that you do spread value and goodness and kindness wherever you go.
Yeah, man. I love that. And I think I totally agree. It's like, be present. This is something I've been working on myself, is that when I'm talking with someone, I'm there, not checking my phone. And in fact,
that's huge, by the way. Oh man.
Oh man. I refuse calls from people in my company, from my boss, if I'm talking with someone, even if it's just a friendly conversation. Because for me, it's like, what am I going to do? Interrupt this conversation to go have a similar conversation with someone else? Like, how rude is that? And how antisocial, in a sense, is that? It's certainly not pro-social. So that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's great advice. Epictetus was a slave, and look what he did, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So I guess we'll sort of go towards the end there now. Thank you so much, man. I had a lot of fun. Like I said,
me too. This has been amazing, and I'm looking forward to having you on my show as well. We're going to plan that for, I believe, early January would be a good time.
Yeah, 2022. No, I'm definitely up for it. It's been a lot of fun. What do you got? Any closing remarks? Where can people find you if they want to get involved in your community? Where's your book?
Yeah, well, I guess here's what I would say. Firstly, I'm doing this community called The Walled Garden. That's the new name of the podcast. So if you've been listening to the Practical Stoic, it's now The Walled Garden. I know there's still some stragglers who have lost the podcast. It's now out there in the ether and they're looking for it. It's called The Walled Garden. And we're also doing a community there. So if you go to thewalledgarden.com, Sharon LaBelle and Kai Whiting, who many of you will know, will be there hosting meetup groups. And the cool thing about The Walled Garden as well is I'm posting all of the poetry that I haven't yet released to the world to The Walled Garden for my members there. It will eventually find its way out into the internet world, and hopefully into print, like The Poet and the Sage. But if you want to find out where I'm at ahead of the curve, then you can join there. And the other thing I'd just say is, for those who are interested in reading The Poet and the Sage, I would be honored if you would consider, purchasing the hardcover version. I will be recording the audiobook and putting it on The Walled Garden this December, this month. But for those of you who still really love holding a beautiful book in your hands, when I designed The Poet and the Sage, I love what's written in it, and I think that it's going to be transformative for people. But I think equally as importantly, not equally, it's not equal, but almost as importantly, is the virtue of the build of the book. So it's a hardcover, it's beautiful material bound. There's actually poetry that people will get in the hardcover book that they won't get in any other version, including online. And I really wanted this book to be a work of art. And so for those who still love holding a book in their hands, I know that if you purchase this book, and you can get it from thewalledgarden.com, thewalledgarden.store, I know that they will have a really beautiful experience reading it, because it's exactly what I wanted. It's the most virtuous book that I could put together in terms of its design, at least. So that's what I'd say to people, and I hope you enjoy it. Yeah. Well, no, that's the wrong thing to say, Brandon. I don't want people to enjoy my book. I want them to be transformed as a result of their interaction with my book.
There we go.
That's what I want.
No, man, I can see your passion there, and it's really great to see. I love seeing people just go after it and produce something, and to have something like that to hold and to have pride with it. It's amazing. This is what we need, right? We need people to do this. Maybe it's not a book, maybe it's, anything, but this is what we need more of in the world for sure. So
yeah,
Simon, thank you so much again for your time, and until next time, man.
Yeah, Brandon, this has been so much fun, and thank you for what you're doing. And man, we've only talked a couple of times now, but I feel like we're already becoming good friends, and I would like that to happen. So let's keep the conversation going.
Me as well, brother. All right, until next time. Bye, everyone.